Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast. We have hit episode 51, and I've got a good little episode lined up for you today. We're going to be continuing our talk on the Hibernate framework. So if you haven't heard that before, heard of that, or you don't know what the heck I'm talking about, you need to go back one episode. In number 50, I did the intro to the Hibernate framework. But today we're going to be diving in a little bit further. But before I do, let's start off with the 5-star reviews that have come in as of actually the last 2 weeks, because I missed doing it last week because we had such an action-packed episode. So far we've had one come in from, it looks like Bill from Chicago, Illinois. He's a software QA analyst, which is great. He leaves a 5-star review saying, great stuff. Another great product of Canada. This show rocks. How about a future show about Maven? Oh boy, look at this. Maven, Git, Jenkins, SCM, etc. So sure, there's plenty of topics that I could go and ramble on, probably for quite a few episodes about. Maybe I should do a show dedicated to Maven, although like I've said, I don't know if I've said it in the last episode, I'm not a pro with Maven by any means. I've actually never used the Jenkins product line before. So, I mean, you know, my expertise really lies with Java and some technologies in and around Java. But in any case, we're going to be talking about frameworks today, more specifically the Hibernate framework. So like I'd said in the last episode, Hibernate is what we use to be able to bring together our database world and our Java world. So it allows us to get Java to communicate with our database without really having to know any SQL. Okay, which kind of is in contrast to the last, I don't know, few episodes that we have done where I've specifically been focusing on teaching the ins and outs of the SQL language, the structured querying language. So why is it that I went through all of that if I can get away, or if you can get away with programming with Hibernate, not having to know anything about databases? Well, it's not actually that simple. You do need to have a fundamental understanding of how databases work. And as a programmer in the real world, you would be at a disadvantage if you did not know how to write the basic SQL scripts, queries, the Crud operations where you can create, read, update, and delete data. If you don't know how to write a select statement, if you don't know how to use a group by keyword, if you don't know how to do an insert, I mean, that would really, those are really big bonuses when you are a programmer, and it's almost a requirement. Okay, so if you don't know how to write these things and you don't know things like database design and like the one-to-many, the many-to-many, those relationships and everything, if you don't have a concept or a grasp on that, you're probably not going to be able to open your world up as much as you possibly could with respect to getting a good programming job, or even going out and programming on your own and creating open source software, or, you know, doing what I did and going out on your own and starting your own business and creating programs on the web, etc., etc. So, you know, all of that SQL training and learning was absolutely not in vain. I think it's an absolute requirement for programmers. But having said that, when you use the Hibernate framework, you actually don't really need to know a whole lot about databases in order to make it work, which is kind of pretty cool. All you really need to know about is relationships. So, like I said, one-to-one, one-to-many, and the many-to-many relationships. So if you don't already know, if you don't already have a knowledge of those relationships, you need to go back in my catalog of shows and start to pick up the introduction to relationships and database relationships. I think I clearly labeled them as one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many. I believe it was across 2 different episodes I talked about those relationships. So, but in any case, I mean, you should really be brushing up and know this stuff, not like the back of your hand, but at least have a passing familiarity, there we go, with these concepts. So, all right, let's dive right into it. So we're going to be talking, like I said, about Hibernate. We're going to be diving further and extending our last talk where we set up our Hibernate project. So we set up a regular Spring web-enabled project, but then we started to sprinkle in our Hibernate configuration. Now, like I'd done last week, I had sort of outlined it as being done through a Java file. So you can configure your Hibernate with your project, your Java project. You can configure it through a Java file. Now, that is sort of the newer, modern way of doing it, but you can also do it through an XML file. I'm not sure if I talked about that, but you can absolutely use an XML file to configure your Hibernate stuff, okay? But I just chose to do the more modern route because, it's 2014 now. It's in July is when I'm recording this. So that's the latest and greatest way to do it. So I might as well stay up to date for you guys for how you go about doing this stuff. So, all right, we've set up our Hibernate. We've created our Java, I think it was called our persistence.config.java file. We sprinkled in all of our annotations, and we sprinkled in all of the database connectivity stuff where we have our username, our password. I talked a little bit about the driver that you need to use to allow Java to talk to the database properly. The example I used was a MySQL driver because we're going to be focusing on doing this stuff and learning this stuff with the MySQL database. But this stuff, these concepts are really applicable to any database. Okay, you can use it with MySQL, you can use it with PostgreSQL, you can use it with Microsoft SQL Server, you can use it with Oracle. Okay, it is really just a set it and forget it type configuration thing, and boom, you're off to the races. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is furthering that and being able to actually create tables and create the columns within our tables. And maybe, if we're lucky, if we have enough time, we're going to talk about how to actually query those tables and populate it with data and read that data, etc., etc. Who knows if we'll have enough time for that? We'll see. So, most importantly, I want to talk about the actual tables and the columns within the tables. So, like I've said before during our introduction to SQL and learning about SQL, tables in SQL are really quite related to Java objects. All right, so a plain old Java object can be recreated, or should be recreated, in the database so that you can actually store that information. Now, it doesn't mean that every single Java object that you have in existence in your application should be recreated as an actual database table, but any objects that make sense to be stored. Usually, these are the types of objects where you have a bunch of instance variables declared and you have getters and setters. Like a Java bean is essentially what they're called. Beans are a great representative of being used as or being represented as a database table. Okay, so things like person, user, who knows? There's so many examples. Of course, I can't even think of any off the top of my head. Address book, any object that has essentially properties associated with it that would need to be stored in the database. Those are ones where you need to have a table created for them. All right. An example of a Java object where you would not need to have a database table created for it are objects that sort of carry out actions. So if you think about like a service, a controller, okay, a database access object, a DAO. I've touched on these briefly in past episodes. Those are all objects that perform actions, and those generally do not have a database table associated with them. It's really just the objects, what Hibernate refers to them as, are entity objects. Okay, so they are an actual entity that represents something in the real world. Like I said, the user object would be great as an entity object in the database world. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on the keyword entity in this podcast episode. All right, and if you're interested, you can go and see all the breakdown of this episode in the show notes, which is obviously howtoprogramwithjava.com/session 51. Hopefully, I say obviously. If this is the first time you're listening to this show, then that's not so obvious. But I've got a great library of stuff on the blog, howtoprogramwithjava.com, and you can go and check out a whole bunch of back catalogs of podcast episodes and tutorials. You can learn Java right from the very beginning as an entry level, person who's maybe never even learned about programming before. This is maybe your first time. You can go there, and there's a whole bunch of great stuff there to get you up to speed on the Java programming language. So, we're going to be talking about entities. Now, when I say an entity, I mean a database table, but that's just a keyword that Hibernate uses. And actually, I should be more clear, Hibernate doesn't use the entity keyword. It's actually part of the Java Persistence API, the JPA framework. And I've touched on that briefly as well. JPA is sort of the standard. It's sort of the programming interface specification that describes like the management of relational data in applications. Okay, so it's that's kind of what Wiki says. It's a specification that describes the management of relational data in applications using the Java platform. So really, it's just it's a collection of sort of best practices and things that if you can picture a bunch of people sitting down in a boardroom hashing out the details of how this thing should work at a very high level. It's kind of complicated and annoying and boilerplate stuff that you just need to deal with. And it's unfortunate because with the programming languages as they are, they're already complex enough, but then you get specifications like these that can get pretty clunky. But in any case, Hibernate is sort of built off of JPA, and it allows you to nicely commingle or cohabitate, if you will, with the JPA specification while also focusing on the Hibernate framework. So Hibernate aims to make it a little bit easier on you, a little bit simpler to implement all of this stuff. But in any case, we will be using some of the JPA specification stuff, like, for example, the entity keyword. Okay. Now, when I say entity keyword, I mean it's an annotation. We talked about annotations a little bit in the last episode, where we have annotations sprinkled both at the class level and at the method level for our Java configuration, our persistence configuration file that we used to set up our Hibernate environment. That's annotations are used very frequently in the Java coding arena, if you will. Just like Spring. Spring relies heavily on annotations as well as Hibernate because they're both frameworks, and these annotations make our lives a lot easier when we are implementing and setting all this stuff up. In any case, I'm getting too focused on the nitty-gritty here, and I might be losing you guys, so let me try to do what it is that I do best and take this stuff and explain it in a nice, straightforward manner. So, what we're going to do here is we have a database table. Let's say we have a user table. Okay, actually, no, we're talking about the address book. That's the example that we were talking about last time. So we have an address book table that we want to create. All right, and inside of this address book table, maybe we want to have we want it to hold things like the person's name, the person's phone number, maybe even a street address or something like that. So we want to create a table that reflects all of that information. Now I'm going to start easy, and then we're going to get a little bit more difficult as we go along in the episodes. I'll probably start without using any complex relationship type stuff just yet, and then we'll move into using more complex relationship stuff so that you can see how to configure it in the Hibernate world. For now, we're going to start off with a simple object with address book. Let's say our address book only contains one person's name, one person's phone number, and one person's street address. Okay, start very, very simple. How do we do this? How do we go ahead and create this? Well, in the previous tutorial series, what you may have done is you would have gone into your SQL IDE. I guess it's not an IDE, but it's whatever visual application you use to create your tables. I use the Toad for MySQL. Who knows what you used? But if you were using Toad, you would go in, you would say File New, you would create a new database, you would call it whatever you like, and then, like, let's say we would call it the Address Book Database. Okay, sounds like a reasonable name. And then we would go into our Address Book Database, and we would create a new table. We would say Create Table Address Book, and we would identify the primary key. We would identify all the fields, so, maybe person's name, like I said, address, and phone number. Okay, so that's what we would do with our database table. But like I said, we want to be able to use Hibernate to create these tables for us without really having to know how to write SQL code. Like I said at the beginning of this, I was sort of promising somewhat that you'd be able to do all this stuff without having to understand SQL code. So how do you do it? Well, you use this entity annotation. All right. Now you'd use it in tandem with your already existing Java bean. And when I say Java bean, I mean that that Java object that you use to represent something that should be stored in the database. So like I said, we were using address book. So let's say we had an address book Java file. It's called a POJO, plain old Java file. We have this plain old Java file that has a class declaration, so it says public class address book. And then within that declaration, we will have the different fields, the different instance variables that exist on it. And we use our data hiding principles, so we're going to use our private instance variables. So we're going to say private string name. Okay, so the person's name will be a string, private string number, or phone number, whichever you prefer to call it. In this case, we'll call it, actually, let's call it phone number. I like that. I actually have it as number in my notes here, but I'm going to change it to phone number because that just makes a whole lot more sense. And then we will have, let's say, a private string street address. Okay, private string street address. And let's go a little bit further. Let's create private string. What would it be? So we have our street address. We would have our probably our zip code. Okay, depending on where you live, it can be called a zip code. It can be called a postal code. Then we can have our, let's see, city. What else? Private string city. Well, state, but we'll call it region because sometimes it's state, sometimes it's province. So we'll call it region just to be nice and unambiguous, or whatever the term is, unambiguous. We're going to be generic. That's where I'm looking for. And obviously private string country, because obviously these people should live in some sort of country around the world. Okay, so that's going to be our plain old Java object that we're going to create. It's our address book, and this is all. None of this is new stuff to you. This is stuff that you've dealt with over and over again, and we're going to go in and we're going to create our getters and our setters for every single one of those instance variables that we have created. So there you go. Now, what are we left with? Well, we're left with a plain old Java object that can be used as a bean to represent an address book. Okay, we have an object that really, has the resemblance of representing a real address book. Okay, this is a physical. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, way back in the day, you would have like a physical book that would have, sort of pocketbook size, and you could flip through it, and it would have it would be organized by letters, so alphabetically from A all the way to Z, and you'd be able to flip through and see who in your address book, let's say it would be by last name. You would flip to the P section, open it up, and then you would see Trevor Page listed there, and you could see, where Trevor Page lives right now, what's his phone number, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, there is a digital representation of an address book now. It's more like a contact book, if you will, like on your iPhone or whatever. You can go to your contacts, and they're all sorted for you, just like it would be in an address book. So that's what we're creating here. We're creating a digital address book where you can add your friends and relatives and acquaintances and everything into this repository, this database of your contacts. It's your address book, okay? So you've created that. Fantastic. But there's nothing to tie it in with the database yet. Okay, so that's the whole point. We want this to then be changed from our plain old Java object into, it's actually still going to remain a plain old Java object, which is nice, but it's going to be a Java object that actually is able to communicate through Hibernate with your database, and it will create the table accordingly. Okay, so that's the goal here. If you were to step back and take one thing out of this entire episode to understand and to learn, it's that we are going to be able to take our Java objects and have them be automatically created as database tables that properly represent the object that we have created. All right, so we've created the blueprint for our address book, like I said, with the name, the phone number, the street address, etc., etc., as a Java object that we can use in Java. and it's going to go and take it and also create it as a database table. So it's going to connect to your database. It's going to connect to the actual database that you created, which is whatever I said address book database is what we would have created. That's the one step where you need to actually go and do it manually. You need to create your database so that it exists, because if you remember from our previous episode, we had a properties file where we actually specified, we had to explicitly specify the name of our database. Okay, which in this case is address book database, which I created when I went into my Toad for MySQL, and I said file new database. So I created a new database through the GUI and called it address book database. Cool. So then it will go and connect to that database, and it will see that, okay, it's going to actually scan. So the process that the framework does is it scans through all your files, and you actually told it at one point in your Hibernate configuration where to scan. Okay, so it's going to scan certain packages, which, remember, packages are like folders, so it's scanning through folders on your hard drive. It's going to scan through and see if there are any objects that you have annotated with the entity annotation. And if it finds any, then it says, okay, this programmer wants this Java object to be recreated and represented in the database as a table. All right, so that's where this magic comes from. That's where the integration comes from, and it's quite simple. I mean, you put in the annotation. Again, it's the at symbol followed by entity, and you put that on the very top of your class. So I say just above the class declaration. So where we said public, what we say, public class, I'm assuming, yeah, public class address book. Okay, that's the actual, in the Java file itself, where we declare the address book class. Just above it, you put in the at entity annotation. And then you import it, because obviously it's not going to know what the heck you're talking about until you import it. And that comes from the JPA stuff. So it's going to be an import from its JavaX or JavaX. I'm not exactly sure the pronunciation there. I'll call it JavaX because I think that's kind of how I say it in my head. So javax.persistent.entity is where it comes from. All right, and that, like we'd said in the previous episode, that becomes available through, I believe, through our Maven stuff that we did. We're able to bring that data in and import it because we imported it from Maven itself. Because I believe JavaX is not part of the standard library of stuff. I don't know if that's a true statement or not, but in any case, it really doesn't matter one way or the other, because you're going to need to be able to use more of the Hibernate stuff in the future, so you're going to need to perform all the Maven imports and stuff like that, or the Maven dependency information in your POM file, your project object model file, which is an XML file, which we talked about, again, in the last episode. That's where we actually told our Java project what to import. Okay, it sort of downloads it all, and it puts it onto our class path, and allows us to actually use these libraries, which is wonderful. It's so much easier to use Maven than to go and do it yourself manually. Trust me. So, but anyway, let's get back on topic. We're going to use the at entity annotation, and we're going to put it above our address book and do the import statement. All right. Again, I use the Control-Shift-O shortcut key. And that just automatically does all the organization for your imports for you automatically. But if you want, you can always go in and type it yourself manually. Up to you. And again, I'll remind you, you can go and see this code. I'll post it in the show notes at howtoprogramwithjava.com/session 51. So, very good. So we put that entity annotation in there, and now Hibernate knows when you're starting up your web server. So this is when it all happens. This is where the magic happens. When it starts up, it does the scan. Okay, it does its first little run through, and it says, okay, this particular object has been flagged, has been annotated with the at entity annotation. So this person wants me being Hibernate, to go and create the table that represents this object in the database. So it will go and it will try to create the table, unless the table already exists, and then it won't do anything. Okay, unless you've made some actual specification as to how you want Hibernate to interact with your stuff. There's a way to set it up so that it will update your tables for you. So let's say you've already created the table, but then you've added another property to it. Like let's say we decide to add in our address book. Actually, like I said, we forgot to include the ID because every table needs a primary key. So we need to actually include that as part of our Java object, okay? So, I mean, it probably wouldn't have worked if we hadn't put the ID in there. Maybe that's a bad example. Let me think of a different example. Let's say we also wanted to include their email address. Let's say that's important for the address book. So let's say we've run it once. It's created the table already, so the table exists. But then we want to update that and put in an email address. Well, if you configured it in a certain way, which is actually very simple, it's just one piece of code in, I believe, a properties file. Is that true? Is it the properties file? Actually, no, it's probably the Java persistence, the persistence config file that we've created. Let me just go and scan it really quickly and see. Oh, I actually don't see it in here. Maybe it is part of the persistence, or not the persistence, the properties file. Let me go and open up my properties file. Yes, okay. So it's in the properties file. There is a line actually at the very bottom where you can specify, it specifies create -drop, but you can also specify update in there. So I'll get back to that in a second. That's not, I'm kind of getting off topic again. That's not mandatory for you to know right now. But in any case, Hibernate's going to go on the startup of the server, the web server. It's going to it's going to create the table. If the table is already created, you can make it so that it'll update the table. So it will add additional columns into the table if need be. And it's great. I mean, it does that all for you automatically. Almost all you need to do is just add the @entity annotation, and it will handle everything for you. So that's how powerful Hibernate is, okay? There's a few other things that you need to know about, like let's say 2 things, maybe 3 things you need to know about before this works like a charm every time. But that's it. It's quite easy to use the Hibernate framework once you have it configured, once you have it set up. Like I said, the annoying setup part is done once, and then you set it and forget it, and then you can go on and use it to your will, to your advantage for all the rest of the project life cycle, the time that this project exists, which is a long time. Okay, so very, very good. So let's move on into the other key things that you need to understand and learn about in order to properly create the representation of the object in your database table, or as a database table. So the other thing I hinted at was the ID. We need to have a primary key for each and every table, right? That was kind of a rule that we had learned about back when we were learning about SQL. So how are we going to do that? Well, it's not very complicated. We just add it in as an actual instance variable. So just like we added in the name, the phone number, the street address, the city, the region, the country, the zip code, we also add an ID. Okay, so this one I usually just call it ID, but if you want to, you can name it address book ID. Again, completely up to you, but I just choose ID all the time for all my objects because I'm lazy like that. But the most important part is the data type you use. So some people use integer, okay, and some people use the long data type. Now the benefits, going back and forth with those are that when you use an integer data type, it's smaller than a long, so it doesn't take up as much room on your hard drive. But the disadvantage of that is that the integer only goes up to, well, I shouldn't say only. I believe it goes up to something like 2.3 billion or 2.4 billion. So, I mean, that's a lot of IDs. So if you don't think that your database table is ever going to have more than 2.4 billion entries in it, then by all means you can go ahead and use the integer data type. If you think it might use more than 2.4 billion, then you use the long data type. Now, just to future-proof all of the applications that I use the long because generally database, space in the database doesn't come at a premium. It's usually pretty cheap. And all the benefits that come around it, I just think it outweighs the benefits. It outweighs the cons of using the actual long data type. So I create my IDs using the long data type. long story short, I just declare it as private long with a capital L, because remember, we don't want to use the primitive long. We want to use the actual object representation of the long data type. Actually, I said obviously, but I don't think I've explained why you need to do that. You need to do that because otherwise it can't use it inside of the Hibernate framework well enough. It can't, it needs to be the object representation of the data type. So you always use objects whenever you are dealing with these frameworks. That goes with the, instead of using int, use integer. Instead of using long with a lowercase l, you use long with an uppercase L, etc., etc. So just like we talked about this way back when we were talking about collections, when you're trying to store something in a hash map, you can't store primitives in a hash map. For the same reasons, it needs to be the object representation. So I'm going to create the private long ID. Now, I create also the getter and setter for the long ID variable, okay? Fair enough. Again, we've done this a million times before. This is nothing special about this. Okay, so we create the getter and setter. But here's where it gets, here's the second thing that you need to know if you want to properly create your Hibernate table for your address book. When you create the ID, you need to specify that this is the actual ID. So you need to tell Hibernate, hey, this field here, this instance variable that I've created is going to be the ID for this table. And how do you do that? You use annotations. Again, a lot of this comes back to annotations. I'd say almost everything in Hibernate comes back to using annotations, which is lovely. Now, as an FYI, as an aside, you can also do all this using an XML file, use an XML like mapping file, but that's kind of really old school now. Those XML files were used, I say really old school, probably like 4 or 5 years ago, which in the the time frame, the life cycle of technology these days, that's like ancient history 5 years ago. So now we use annotations. So don't get confused if you see someone with an example online that's showing you an XML file. You can do it that way, but since I'm teaching you with the annotation way, you want to skip all the tutorials that deal with XML files, okay? If you see an XML file for mapping, the IDs and the relationships and all that stuff, ignore it, find another one. Maybe when your Google search, type in annotation as a keyword. Just append the word annotation onto your search in Google, and that will hopefully find the right way, or at least the right tutorial for you to be able to get up and running with a good example that uses annotations. So anyway, you need to use an ID annotation, and it's simple. I mean, what you do is the other key thing that you need to know here is that when you're using the annotations, again, they're either going to be on the class level or the method level. The @entity annotation is on the class level because, like I said, it's just above the public class address book declaration. Okay, that means it's class level because it's at the, it's just above the class declaration itself. That means it's class level. This one, the @ID annotation, it's sort of like the flag that you use to tell Hibernate which variable is the actual ID for this table. That's at the method level. So you can put it just above the getter for the ID field. So in my code, I have public long get ID, which is the getter for the ID instance variable. I have just above that, just above the getter, I have the @ID annotation, and there you go, done. So that now you've used it as a flag to tell Hibernate that this ID variable, the long ID, is going to be the ID for the table. Great, fantastic. The other thing that you need to do is to tell Hibernate what strategy to use for generating values, for this field, okay? Because if you remember back when we were learning about SQL and writing SQL code and creating tables, you hopefully should remember when we were creating the primary keys for the table, we actually had to mark it as primary key. So we would type in, when we said, create table, address book, we would say ID, int 11, and then we would say primary key, and then we would also say auto increment. Okay, those were the two things that we had to put into our declaration when we were creating our table to make it work nicely. It's the exact same thing that's going on here in the world of Java with our annotations. When we put the @id annotation, that tells it to make it the primary key. And when we use the @generated value, which is the next annotation that I'm going to be talking about, again, these are very simple annotations. Copy, paste, done. But it's important to understand why you're copy pasting them. This is the @generated value annotation, and this is what we use to tell it how to generate the values, which it equates to putting auto increment into your SQL code if you were to create the table manually. So we say @generated value, but now this time we're going to have some brackets. We're going to open up a round bracket, and we're going to say strategy equals, and then we're going to use a static call to probably a constant. I believe it's a constant. This one is generation type dot auto. Okay, again, it sounds complex over audio, but it really isn't, guys. You just copy paste it in. All it's saying is we're using it. There's a way to generate values, and we're in this case we're using the auto generated generation type strategy. Okay, if I read the actual code for the sort of Java doc that goes along with this, it says the generation type auto indicates that the persistence provider should pick an appropriate strategy for the particular database. Okay, so you're telling it, just, figure it out yourself is essentially what we're doing here, okay? We're telling it to automatically figure out what generation strategy to use. When you're using MySQL, that's going to equate into it using the auto increment strategy, okay? Because the auto increment strategy is the default and a very good way to create your primary keys for your table, okay? So, and there's certainly other generation type strategies. There's different strategies for creating your primary keys, but honestly, guys, I've never used anything other than just the auto generation type. Okay, if you're getting into more advanced stuff and you want to do something crazy, then you're going to be wanting to tweak it and do something different. And then, by all means, you can learn about it when you need to do it, if you need to do it. But I'm telling you, I've never needed to do it, so we can sort of shelve that and make it a just-in-time learning venture. So, okay, great. So we've learned about the fact that we have to annotate our class with the @entity annotation. Okay, that tells Hibernate to create the database table to represent, or as a representative of this object. We need to be able to, create an ID as an instance variable and create getters and setters. Okay, fair enough. And then for the getter method for the ID, so the get ID method, we need to annotate it with two different annotations. One is to mark it as the ID itself, because we're telling Hibernate this is my ID column, because otherwise it doesn't know which column to use. And then we mark it with the way that it should generate values for that particular ID, okay, that particular column. Like I said, this is exactly what we had to do when we were in the land of SQL and creating our tables manually, okay? And then that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all you need to do to actually have this table created. So then you can go and you can hit start on your web server, and then it will go and it will create that database table for you. Boom, just like that. It'll create it, and it'll have all the appropriate fields. It'll have the name, the phone number, the street address. Everything will be created. It's probably going to use a bunch of default values. So probably all the string fields that we created, they're going to have a length of 255 characters. They're going to be a varchar. And the long itself, I forget what it creates as a long. I could probably go ahead and hit start on. Let me see if I can hit start on my actual application, and we'll see if it goes and creates. I think it uses big int. If I'm not mistaken, it uses the big int data type on inside your SQL database, your MySQL database, I should say. Yeah, I believe that's what it does. Big int. Like I said, the reasoning behind that is because I want to future-proof it so that just in case that particular table needs to have more than 2 point whatever billion entries in it, I won't run into any sort of problems. Okay. That's being quite future-proof in my opinion. But hey, I always like to think ahead. So there you have it. So that's how you go ahead and create the address book table. Now, another thing that you might want to know about, just some supplemental fun materials, is that sometimes you want to have your table named something a little bit different from what the default name is. Okay, so if you go ahead and you were to create this table as is, if you were to go and run your code, your web server were to start up and do its thing and everything, and it would start up successfully, what it actually does is, because address book, I've named it with a capital A and a capital B. Okay, address book, because it's sort of two words. What Hibernate does is it doesn't really recognize how to name your actual database table, or even your columns within the database. So if I go ahead and run this, I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about, or at least I'll tell you exactly what I'm talking about. If I run this, it goes and it creates the table, but it doesn't create it as address underscore book. Okay, that's kind of the methodology that we've been using, like the actual naming convention that we've been using to create our tables. So we would, or even not just our tables, but our columns, we were using the underscore to separate the words from each other. But if we go ahead and run this, Hibernate doesn't know how to name it with the underscores. Okay, so all it's going to do is just going to create a table called address book, with no underscore between address and book. And same for, I believe, if you were to go into the actual column names itself, they would just name them based on what you put in. So if you put in phone number as all one word with lowercase p and an uppercase n, it's going to do the exact same thing. It's going to create it as just that, all one word in your database. Okay, in your database table, I should say. And that is not ideal. So what we could do to mitigate that, to solve that issue, because it will become an issue later on, just because, like I said, that's a convention that we have in SQL and creating and naming our tables and whatnot. That convention exists for a reason. So we need to address that issue. So how you can do that is you can tell if you have a table name that is more than one word. Okay, the problem I'm talking about is when you have a table name or a column name that is more than one word. If it's just one word, then who cares? Then it's going to be the correct convention for what it's called. But if you have more than one word in your table name or your column name, you need to tell Hibernate how to name that particular table or column. Okay, and we do that again through, hopefully, can you guess what we use to do this? I'll give you a moment to think about it. What can we use to tell Hibernate to name our tables something different than the default? We would use an annotation. If you guessed annotation, good on you. If you didn't guess annotation, then, well, from now on, you should always guess annotation when I'm talking about Hibernate. So here, what I can do is, going back up to the class level, so where we have our at entity annotation, we can add another annotation. This one's going to be the at table annotation. Okay, so we can say at table, and then we open our bracket, and we give it a name. So we say name equals, and then as a string, we give it the actual real name that we want to give the proper name to the table. So we say address underscore book as a string, and then obviously we close our bracket there. And there you go. Again, this will all be, you'll be able to see this in the show notes. It's very straightforward. It's very hard to screw it up or hard to not understand it when you see it. Don't let it get overcomplicated in your head at all. It's just you're saying, I want to name the table something different than the default. How do I do that? I use the at table annotation. Okay, cool. So going on into, let's say we have some column names, like for example, phone number, street address, zip code. Those are all, they all have more than one word in them, so the same problem applies. What Hibernate will do is it'll create it as all one word, and we don't want that to happen. So how do we tell Hibernate how to name those particular columns? Okay, hopefully you get it by now. Hopefully you're saying an annotation. Yes, you are correct. So just like we use an at table annotation on the class level, now we're on the method level. We're going to use an at column annotation. All right, look, it'll take you a few probably months or a few weeks of using these over and over again before you're comfortable with them and remember what the heck they're called. I know when I first started, I was always having to copy paste other people's code, and because I would never remember what these stupid annotations were called. But it'll grow on you. You'll get it eventually. If you want to really understand it, then force yourself to type it all out manually over and over again whenever you're doing this stuff, and don't copy paste, because then you'll remember it. You can go and cheat, and you can look at other people's code, but don't copy paste it. Actually force yourself to type it in manually. That's a good trick that I use to actually remember, again, these, what I'll lovingly call stupid annotations. So we use the at column annotation at the method level to specify what the column name should be. So for the phone number, again, we're always focusing on the getter methods here. So another thing that you should sort of put into your mind is when you're dealing with Hibernate and annotations at the method level, always put them on the getter, not the setter. Okay, if you put this on the setter, it does not scan the setters, so it will not pick up any annotations that you put on the setters. So it will be a bad situation. All right, so we're putting this on the getter levels, the method levels for the getters. I'm going to say at column. I'm going to open my bracket. I'm going to say name equals, just like we did with a table. We're going to say name equals, and I'm going to type in phone underscore number. Okay, I'm telling it what the column name should be. All right, and again, it's on the getter method. And then I scroll down. I go to my get street address, and same thing, at column, open bracket, name equals street underscore address. Done. Then one last one, I go to the zip code. In the get zip code, just above it, I say at column, open bracket, name equals zip underscore code. Save the code. Done and done. All of the other ones, all the other getter methods for all the other fields we have in here, you don't need to annotate with the column annotation. If you want to, you can, but it's kind of redundant code. You're just going to be overriding the default functionality that Hibernate already has built in. It won't cause you an error. It's just a lot of typing that you don't need to do. All right. So there you go. That is really all the things, all the information I could throw at you right now with respect to how to properly annotate a plain old Java object, your entity object, with all the annotations that you need to get it set up and recognized by Hibernate to have it create the table properly in your database. All right, there you go. There you have it. That's all there is. That's the whole book. Excuse me, on how to do that, and that's fantastic. I mean, Hibernate, again, like I said, it strives to be as easy as it can be, to make it as easy as it can be on you to go ahead and be able to create the database tables and hook it up properly. So, a few last things I want to mention because they can be a bit confusing. If you were to go and follow along in the last show notes page, I would suggest you go there and check it out. howtoprogramwithjava.com/session 50. If you go there, there's a great video I actually recorded and put on the show notes page that brings you through step by step how to create this address book project that we're working on. And I highly recommend you go watch the video, set it up yourself. Okay, create it in your own environment because there's no better way to learn than to do it yourself. And once you are set up with that, and you are good to go, then you can go and do all the stuff that we've talked about today, which is create the address, or rather hook the address book table up with, or actually no, it wouldn't be hook it because I don't think I created the address book table in the last episode. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. You'll create the address book Java object. Maybe I'll record another video for this one as well. And yeah, sure, why not? Let's make more work for myself. I'll create a video and put it in this show notes for episode 51 or session 51. You'll be able to follow through that and set all this stuff up. But in any case, I'm rambling. The point I'm getting at here is it can be confusing because once you start up your web server, actually I should say before you start up your web server, you might try to see if the table was created, and it won't be. And you'll say, oh, that's interesting. Then you'll start up your web server, and you'll see if the database table was created, and you'll see that it should be. If it starts up and you did everything correctly and there's no errors, the table will be there. And you'll say, oh, cool, excellent. The table's there. Maybe you'll go and fiddle around with it and try to populate data into it. Fine, whatever. And you'll see that it's there and it works and it has the stuff in it and fantastic. And then maybe you'll stop your web server, or you'll close down your Spring Source tool suite or whatever, which will indeed stop your web server. then you might go back to the database and try to take a look at it again, and you'll see that the table's missing. Okay? This is where things get confusing if you don't know what the heck is going on. I know I was confused. You'll say, where the heck did my table go? It's gone. I swear I was just looking at it. I swear I was just using it. The issue is in your properties file. So if you go to your persistence MySQL properties file, you'll see at the very end, the very last line I have in the properties file is a Hibernate properties, I don't know what you call it, what would that be called? It's just a Hibernate properties thing, and that's a real good technical term for it, thing. But it's hibernate hbm2ddl.auto. Okay, very horrible naming convention there. I don't know what hbm2ddl stands for, but basically what I want you to look at is the right-hand side of that. It says equals, and the default one that I have here is called create-drop. So what that means is when the server starts, it's going to create the table, which is great. You want it to do that. And then when the server stops, it's going to drop the table, which means delete the table. So that's what's happening. Every time you start your server, it's going to create the table. And then when you stop your server, it's going to drop and delete the table. And you might think, well, why the heck would you want to do that? Well, it's kind of good when you're first starting out in the development of your application, and you just sort of want to always have a fresh database to start with. That's a great thing to use. You have the create and drop functionality. You can even tie it in. I won't get into this now, but you can tie in some default pre-populated data for your databases. You can actually pre-populate all of your database tables with specific information based on like a SQL script that you include in a certain way inside of your project. And then what's going to happen is it'll create a table, it'll pre-populate it with all the data that you want, and then you can go and use it as, maybe that's a great way to set up a bunch of test cases for you or something like that. And then when you stop your server, it'll drop everything and delete everything because maybe you've mucked around with it and messed around with it, and it's a whole bunch of crap in there now and bad data. And then you can start from scratch again with your fresh test case or whatever it is that you're working with. So that's why you have a create and drop function. All right. But if you don't want it to do that, if you don't want it to always create and drop your table, you can change that property. So you can delete create-drop, and you can, I believe it's just update. You can type in the word update. And if you do that, then when what happens is when your server starts, with just the update keyword, it will create the table if a table doesn't exist. Okay, and then, which is great, you want it to do that. And then when you stop your server, it sees that you have it set as just update, so it will not drop your table. It will not delete it. It'll leave it as is. And then when you start it again, what it does is it scans your entity file, so all the files that you marked as with the @entity annotation. It will see if anything is different between the file and your actual database table. And if there is anything different, it'll update your database table with respect to the actual structure of the table. Not the data inside of it, but the structure. So like I was hinting at the beginning, or not the beginning, but maybe midway through this episode, I was talking about being able to update the table on the fly, where let's say you added, you want to put in the email address into the address book. When you add email address into your addressbook.java file and you have it set as update, it will see that there's a change between your Java file and the table, and it'll say, oh, they want to add another field into, or another column in the database, and it'll go and it'll just do an alter the table, and it'll not update, it will it'll alter the table and add your new column that you've specified in your Java file. So it's a really good way to keep everything sort of together. It's a good way to keep everything in sync. Is to have just the update command for your hibernate.hbm2ddl.auto property. All right. Again, horrible name, but you'll see what I mean when you either check it out in the video that I'm going to record for you guys, or in the show notes. I'll paste my properties file, and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. All right. So there you go. I guess I was not able to get into the latter parts because we're already almost an hour in. I kind of figured that was going to happen. So in the next episode, we're going to dive into how to actually communicate with your database table. Now that you've created this address book table, and it has fields in it, it has columns and all that good stuff. It has a primary key that you've assigned to it and everything. Now let's do the CRUD operations. Let's start to be able to insert data in there and all that wonderful stuff. Now this starts to get a little bit complex when we start to do this stuff, because generally what you want to do is you want to have an actual GUI, some sort of graphical user interface that ties itself into the actual creation of data, right? Because we're getting into forms now. Let's say you have a username registration form. You want to type in the username, the password, and all that stuff. Or let's say you want to insert something into your address book. You need a form to fill out to be able to say, I want to put in the record Trevor Page at this address and this zip code and this country, etc., etc. You need some way to grab the data and input it and then put it into the actual table itself. When we're getting into that sort of functionality, then that really lends itself well to using things like HTML. Okay, that becomes your graphical user interface, is your HTML code. And I haven't really talked about HTML yet, so I guess what's going to happen with the future episodes is I'm going to be focusing on, I guess, hard coding a lot of information, which is unfortunate. I would like to not focus on hard coding, but like I said, I haven't taught HTML just yet, so that'll be the next topic, I guess, that we get into, the next logical stepping stone in our journey of learning how to design and create web applications. But I guess for now, we can just put the data into the Java file itself and kind of bypass having an actual input field, an actual GUI. So I guess that's what we're gonna have to end up doing. But in any case, it'll get really cool. We'll be able to. I'll show you exactly how you can insert the data in there, and read it back. So scan, how to select from a table, and all sorts of great stuff. Deleting the information, blah blah blah. It really gets really neat with how you use the ins and outs of Hibernate. And what is really cool is, like I said, all of this knowledge can be applied to not just MySQL, but to any database, relational database management system that you can sub in to Hibernate itself. Again, that's just a one little part of the setup process to switch it out. You can swap out and bring in a whole new database if you like, and all of your code will still work beautifully. Okay, so that's why Hibernate is so powerful in its flexibility and its ease of use. All right. Whew. So, ladies and gentlemen, always a pleasure. I will obviously have to direct you once again to the How to Program with Java show notes. So go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/session 51. You'll see all the goodies, all the code that I've been talking about, along with a nice explanation again in writing for those of you who like to read it as well. And like I said, I'm promising you a video as well, so you'll see how I go about and create this actual file itself in the video and play around with the properties like I mentioned. All right? Excellent. So until next time, I wish you the very best. I can't wait. Actually, until our next webinar, I should be putting one on. I've been busy this month. If you're listening to this in real time, we're in July, so I don't know when the next webinar will be. But please, by all means, if you're not on my email list already, get on my email list. You're going to get tons of cool stuff. I send you a copy of the top, I think it's top 7 resources that Java professionals like myself use every single day. I think 85% of them are free to use, which is fantastic, and that's just great to get and great to know and great to have. Plus, I hit you with all the good stuff about getting up and running with the Java programming language, all as part of my the subscription to my email newsletter, etc., etc. So get on my email list if you're not on there, howtoprogramwithjava.com. It's at the very top of the page. You'll be able to subscribe, or usually at the bottom of any of my posts, you'll see a little sign-up form will appear, and you can get on that way. Because, as a bonus as well, you're going to be getting invitations to webinars where I give a great deal of information out about a very specific topic that you guys asked for in advance. So it's actually really cool, really interactive stuff, and it's a great way to learn and to ask questions and to get rid of the fuzziness on a certain topic in programming. So get on that email list, guys. Can't wait to see you there. And until the next time, happy learning and take care of yourselves. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.